Hey, welcome back to A Conversation With. My name is Philip DeFranco, and there's no one next to me. So the podcast is coming back. How we're starting it back up is I actually have a whole conversation with Andrew Yang. Part of it was for another video, but we ended up talking just for an hour. And I've gotten a lot of requests to release the whole thing. So I said, hey, let's definitely do that. That's how we'll bring the podcast back before doing a new quarantine digital version of the podcast. But actually, before we get started, I want to take a quick second to thank one of the partners of today's podcast, Pank One Network, to help fight pancreatic cancer. And you may have heard about pancreatic cancer in the news, since a number of celebrities such as Steve Jobs, Patrick Swayze, Alan Rickman, and so many others have been lost to this disease. Right, and pancreatic cancer is considered the deadliest cancer with only an 8% survival rate, and that rate has remained almost unchanged over the past 40 years due to underfunded research. All while other types of cancer have seen their survival rates double or triple in that same 40-year period. And Pank One is making incredible strides in understanding the various subtypes of the disease to develop the best possible treatments, and every donation gets them closer to that goal of raising the rate. And that's where you and I come in. Personally, I'll be donating the ad revenue from today's video to the cause, and if you'd like to contribute as well, you can click on the link in the description down below to donate. Every little bit helps fund the research that can save thousands of lives, so if you're able to at all, I want to thank you in advance. But with that said, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Andrew Yang. Andrew, thank you so much. I like that apparently we're on first name bases. That's how I'm opening up the video. Thank you very much for making the time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. I know it's a tough time for all of us, but hopefully, the two of us talking can at least entertain people and take their mind off it.
Yeah, and I mean, part of it I think is also a lot of this video. I've been really diving into UBI over the past week. You're someone that I would definitely credit as popularizing it in the States, and so I kind of want to talk about that. I have some questions from viewers. I have some questions that I'm just wondering, and if you want, we can just jump into it.
Yeah, I would love that.
Okay.
I'm very happy just to jump right in.
So today, I was mentioning it to you before we started. I saw you on Business Insider, and during your campaign, you talked about your UBI being $1,000, but now it sounds like you're talking about moving forward. The proposal would need to be more than that. I guess the question is, there were already questions about how could we pay for it in its previous form. How do you think that we could do it if it's even higher?
My original freedom dividend was funded primarily through a new mechanism to get some of the gains in parts of the economy that are experiencing explosive growth and put those funds into our hands. Amazon's the most prominent example that we all know and love / hate, where they're worth $1 trillion. They're hiring 100,000 new employees, even while the rest of us are hiding and hemorrhaging. And they paid zero in taxes last year, and that's not historically unusual for them. And so if you create a mechanism where we're all getting our tiny fair share of every Amazon sale, every Google search, every Facebook ad, eventually every robot truck mile, we can pay for a lot of things, particularly because after this money goes into our hands, we're just going to spend it right into our local economies anyway. So that was the math behind my original freedom dividend. It is true that if we're going to ramp it up, because the needs are going to be so much higher, we may have to look for additional ways to fund it. But one thing I'm confident of is that we have the resources as a society, and we're seeing it right now. It's like the government has been pleading poverty, and then now that the house is on fire, they're printing $2.2 trillion and saying, let's put the fire out, which is 100% the right thing to do. But it just goes to show that when there's enough will behind it, we can still do very, very big things, and we have the resources to do them.
Right. Now, so for the previous proposal, when we were looking around, we found that estimates put that at about $3 trillion a year. Did you previously find those estimates to be accurate in your thinking?
They were a little bit high for a number of reasons. My plan was just for adults, and so you end up bringing down the number significantly because, like kids don't get it until they mature. And there were some other elements of my plan that ended up making it less expensive. But big picture, what most people who look at the numbers miss is the fact that the money doesn't actually disappear. Like if you get the money and you're an average American who's been struggling to make ends meet even before the crisis, where does the money go? It goes into car repairs you've been putting off and little league signups and daycare expenses, and then that money circulates over and over again through your local economy. It ends up creating tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of new jobs. There was a prison guard in New Hampshire who said to me, we should pay people to stay out of jail because we spend so much when they're in jail. And this was a corrections officer. So the big misconception is that if you put $2 trillion a year into our hands, that the money's just gone. Like the money's just going to go into the economy over and over again. And if you analogize it to big companies that issue dividends every quarter to their shareholders, everyone thinks that's a great idea. And no one ever follows the shareholder home and says, how did you spend your Verizon dividend? Like, what a waste of money that was for Verizon. They should have kept it. So it's the same thing with us, where we're the citizens and owners and stakeholders in the society. You give us the money. It's actually the best, most efficient use of resources.
So you think that it just you think it just makes the machine bigger, the money won't leave, right? So it's not this expenditure that, you know, the money just goes out there and it disappears. You see it as something that continues to feed the machine. Is that accurate?
Well, it's necessary for our economy to continue to function, especially now, because, Philip, the brutal truth is that a lot of the jobs that are getting eliminated by this crisis are not going to come back. I heard from a friend who consults to major company CEOs, and they're all telling them, we're not going to hire all these people again. You know, like they're now, I mean, the example we all understand is the grocery stores who are now putting more robots in their aisles. And we look at that and say, well, that makes a heck of a lot of sense, because literally you just don't want people in the grocery store aisles. But you have thousands of businesses doing the same thing, automating processes, some of which are not like in the back office, invisible to the eye. Another example we'd all understand, Macy's just announced that they're going to furlough most of their 130,000 employees. Do we really think that they're going to rehire all 130,000 of those employees, you know, in 6 or 8 months or a year? So the needs are going to be even clearer, that we have to come up with new ways of creating jobs and getting resources into people's hands, because the market is not going to do it. And it's going to make government all the more central to the functioning of the economy, which I know is not great to hear for many people listening to this. Be like, oh gosh, like, you know, some people listening would be like, yeah, that's great. But that is the reality we're going to be faced with, because the needs are going to be so stark and severe. There is no way that the government will not have a central role in what things look like, not just during the crisis, but after.
So when you say that some people will hate to see that, do you think it's because this is in part a call for more and bigger government?
Well, I think that some people don't trust that the government is going to do great things if you put a lot of economic decision making into its hands, or that if they even do decide to do the right thing, they might not be great at administering it in an efficient way. I think that there are many Americans that believe that. And, you know, we do have some direct experience with that, like when healthcare.gov got rolled out and it was like a bit of a nightmare. And then we're all like, oh no, like, you know, like this is, you know, so there's some relationship to reality, but that's what we're going to be experiencing in the months and years to come. And using healthcare, sticking with that as an example, the push for Medicare for all is going to become much, much more powerful, because if you're going to lose millions of jobs, having an employment-based healthcare system makes zero sense. So there are the people who are resistant to the fact that the government needs to get involved in the healthcare market. It's going to have to get involved in the healthcare market if we're going to avoid having many, many Americans who are completely locked out, essentially, or pushed out of the system.
Now, with obviously there's UBI and then there's the stimulus bill, drastically different things. But when you see the move for $1,200 to individuals, $500 for children, what does it feel like for you as someone that's pushed for UBI, seeing the government doing that? I know you kind of touched on it in a second, of like when the house is on fire, all of a sudden, oh, now we can do it, right? It kind of exposes that it is very possible. But yeah, what do you feel when you see that?
I feel heartbreak like everyone else that the country's in this position. Like I'm trapped in my home, you're trapped in your home, whoever's listening to this is probably trapped in their home. And if you're not trapped in your home, you probably should go to your home. Unless, of course, you're doing something indispensable to society, and then thank you for that. So it's heartbreaking that we're in this situation. Certainly, I'm excited that we're at least partially adopting universal basic income to put money into people's hands immediately. I will say it's disappointing that a relatively small proportion of the $2.2 trillion is going directly into our hands. I think it's like 250 billion or so. And I'm disappointed that it's only once, because the fact is you put $1,200 or $1,700 into our hands in April. That money's not going to last that long. We're going to be in the same boat in May if we're all still in the midst of this crisis. So Congress should have had triggers and said, look, you're going to get this not just once, but every month until the crisis is over, whenever that happens to be. Because a lot of it is not just concrete, it's also people's visibility, where even if you put $1,700 into my hands right now, if I don't know where my next paycheck's going to come from and I don't know when things are going to reopen, I'm still stressed out. I'm still not going to feel good about my future at all. Whereas if you say, look, your future is assured while we're in this crisis, then we might have more people that are frankly adhering to public safety guidelines because they can be more at ease with it. It's like we all know that the people who are able to shelter in place tend to be more affluent, where they aren't worried about life and death expenses.
So I know there's conversation about now like a fourth lever to pull, right? There's been proposals from the likes of Bernie Sanders talking about $2,000 a month for the extent of this crisis. If that legislation magically came across your desk, you could insert whatever you wanted to at this moment. What would that look like?
It would look exactly like that. It would be $2,000 per person per month of the crisis. And then you would see everyone ease up. You'd have people feel like their future is going to be secure, even if this drags on for a long time. And there's a very real chance it will drag on for a long time.
Well, so I guess that was something I'm interested in there, because I've seen some critics to the idea of doing something that is kind of open-ended, could last longer, but is for a moment of crisis, that it's essentially a Trojan Horse UBI, because it's 10 times easier to give the American public something than it is to take away, right? The idea of covering pre-existing conditions, awesome. The idea of taking it away, horrific, right? So what would you say to that?
Well, you're talking to Andrew Yang, so I love the idea of it being there forever. It's not a Trojan horse in my mind. It's just a horse. Like, just ride up and be like, let's do it.
Right. So that's the straight in your face goal. But I guess for those that are proposing it, I guess, okay, so if you had to argue it from the point of a politician that's saying this is an emergency measure, how would you do that?
The great thing is there was clear consensus that we needed to do this, and so from their perspective, it's like, well, we're doing this because the house is on fire and no one can feed themselves, and then when you can all feed yourself again, then we'll stop doing it. Obviously, I disagree with that perspective, because to me, it's helpful in good times and bad. And the fact is, many Americans were not making ends meet before this crisis, or we're living hand to mouth. The economic indicators at the top line were obscuring the fact that there was a ton of deprivation and financial insecurity experienced by most Americans. It's not even unusual anymore.
So with your view on UBI, is it still rather pure in that it would be every adult? It wouldn't have limitations like we're seeing with the stimulus bill of there being changes after 75,000 and after 99,000, it's completely gone?
I'm a practical guy. So, anything that moves in this direction, I'm all for. I don't think means testing it was a good idea. I mean, the fact is, a lot of people who did well in their last tax return, maybe in 2018, are really suffering now. And you could have given them the money and then just clawed it back in next year's tax return, but it would have helped them get through this time. So to me, means testing it was an error. But I'm not against us making good moves even if there were better moves on the table.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I just wanted to take a second to thank one of the sponsors of today's episode of A Conversation With. DoorDash. And right now there are tons of local restaurants that are open for delivery that you can get right on DoorDash. And with over 300,000 partners in the United States, Puerto Rico, Canada, and Australia, you can support your local go-tos or choose from your favorite national chains. And ordering is easy. You open up the DoorDash app, you choose what you want to eat, and the food will be left safely outside your door with the new contactless delivery drop-off setting. A setting that I will add, I hope they keep forever, even in the future when things calm down. Right now, best of all, our listeners, our viewers can get $5 off the first order of $15 or more and 0 delivery fees for the first month when you download the DoorDash app and enter in code DeFranco. That's $5 off your first order and 0 delivery fees for a month when you download the DoorDash app in the App Store and enter code DeFranco. Don't forget, that's code DeFranco for $5 off your first order with DoorDash, and they asked me to say that 3 times, just in case you were to somehow forget that it is $5 off your first order and 0 delivery fees for a month. Maybe they had me say it so many times so I would pronounce things correctly once. But with that said, back to your it's over. Back to your regularly scheduled podcast. One of the questions, I know you constantly get questions about general inflation, but there was a question from a viewer that asked, one of the largest expenses for young people is rent, which seems to increase every time I sign a new lease. If we were to be given a universal basic income, wouldn't landlords simply raise their prices knowing that we can afford a higher rent expense? And what systems could be put into place to prevent this?
So there are 3 core costs that are making us all miserable, young people in particular. They are housing, education, and healthcare. And those are the areas where inflation has been most extreme over the last number of years. If you think about everything else in our lives, clothing, most food, cars, entertainment, travel, like most of it stayed the same or in some cases gotten better or cheaper. But then your housing keeps getting jacked up, education keeps getting more expensive, and your healthcare costs just keep skyrocketing. So it is true that we need to have countermeasures in place, not just strict rent control all around, but possibly cost of living increases that you can't have your rent surge. I'm more optimistic than the questioner is, though, about the mechanics of the market, and here's why. So let's say that you're living together. I'm the president. I give you all, let's call it $1,000 a month just for ease. So then you and your roommate together have $2,000 more a month. You're very excited. And then when your lease is up, the landlord's like, hey, your rent just went up by $1,200 or whatever. Because I know you can afford it. Ha, ha, ha. You'd look at it and say, wait a minute, that's not cool. And then before just saying yes and signing that lease, you would look around and say, well, are there other landlords that are being more reasonable? And let's say in the very extreme case that all of the landlords are being unreasonable, you and your roommate might get 2 of your friends and say, with the 4 of us, that's $4,000 a month. We can actually go get that fixer-upper house and maybe do something with it. Or we can actually use this income to vote with our feet, because the income actually is mobile. It's not tied to a particular neighborhood the way a job is. So putting money into our hands actually makes us harder to exploit, not easier. Let's put it that way. And I understand the fact that that we know that landlords and corporations are going to try their best to make as much money as possible in every circumstance. And there are circumstances where you have to try and regulate that. Just say, look, we have to make sure you can't just gouge people uncontrollably. But I'm more optimistic than most about the fact that if we had money that went with us wherever we went, that they would increase our flexibility, not decrease it.
Okay, I'm trying to fully understand, because I get it. I understand from the rent control, right? Because that's legislation. That's the government getting involved.
And zoning regs, because if the problem with our housing, there are a lot of problems with it. But the biggest problem is that the incentives are not there to create affordable housing units
Right.
or different types of cooperative housing in most places. The economic incentives are all to try and make these high-end developments for yuppies and gentrification and the rest of it.
I just want to make sure that you weren't saying the secondary solution to that problem was get roommates.
No. In my worldview, they already had roommates.
Okay.
But what I was suggesting was that you could pool income and do more interesting things in terms of your housing because you all just have more income and more flexibility.
Right. And it sounded like that was kind of based off of someone trying to go into something. And the reason I ask is there was also a second person that asked a similar question, and this was more towards people that are, they're already in their house. The rent gets raised because this other thing happens, right? Theoretical world. And they quoted you, and you can say if this was accurate or not, that you've said, well, if your rent raises, just move. Is that accurate, do you think?
What I just said was what they were quoting. Okay. Was that like in an extreme case, like you might be able to do something different with your housing because you have more flexibility, and then they paraphrase that as you can just move.
Okay. Because they said it sounded simplistic. It doesn't take into account that this change that they didn't have a control in, right? It results in them having to move, which is incredibly costly. Or if they have kids, like we both do. I'm
not against rent control measures, and I'm very much for incentives to try and create more affordable housing and innovative housing, because right now those incentives don't exist. Like the incentives to make high-end developments and kick people out are very high, and the incentives to create modular housing or other things that people would find accessible just aren't there. So and this to me is something that the government needs to play a much bigger role in, is trying to put the incentives in place and balancing them. Because even liberals, if you say, are you for affordable housing? They'll be like, yeah. And then they'll be like, are you for affordable housing where you live? And they'll be like, no. So this is very much like a question that each community deals with in different ways. But the government, unfortunately, is going to have to make someone in some neighborhoods say, like, look, like we can't have teachers have to commute 90 miles to get to work because they can't afford to live near the schools to teach your kids.
Do you think that right now there is enough political will to try to give anything that's not just an emergency measure, actual UBI pushed through Congress?
Oh, yeah. So here's what's going to happen, Philip. First, I ran for president, and initially people were like, yeah, that sounds impossible or farcical or far out. And I dropped out in February, and we're going to have a version of it in April. You know what I mean? Like, people are going to be like, wow. And then there's also this recognition that's like, wow, we can do that, and we can do it. Tens of millions of us are going to get a check for $1,200, and we're going to like it. It's not going to turn us into different people. It's not going to turn our neighbors into different people. It's not going to make us all lazy. It's just going to help us pay our bills and have a path forward. And after we all have that experience, I think many, many Americans are going to say, we should probably do that again. So universal basic income is gaining steam, not just here, but Spain just said they're going to adopt a minimum income program that's not universal basic income, but it does provide an income floor. And other legislatures are looking at it because it's the right thing to do in a circumstance where millions of people aren't going to be able to provide for themselves in any other way. And again, we're going to wake up to an economy that has jumped forward years while we've all been trapped in our homes in terms of automation, displacement of workers, software and AI, smaller offices, much more remote work. Some schools that have closed will never reopen because they were at the edge anyway. And the fact that now some of their students aren't going to come back is going to be too much for them to just bear. So we're going to have to think very, very differently and very, very quickly about how we're going to organize this economy. And there are people, I think your subscribers are actually into politics, because I know it's one of the things you talk about a lot. Like it or not, again, government is going to become the center of the economy for the foreseeable future. And politics, I believe, is going to change as a result of that, hopefully in positive directions, but that may or may not happen.
Based off of what you're seeing, the people that you've been talking to, because obviously, like you talked about, places shutting down now, it's not just a rubber band that snaps back in a few months. That doesn't seem to be your viewpoint. How long do you feel like we in the United States are going to feel the impact of what's happening now? And let's say that it continues. We feel it to some degree for 16 months.
We're going to be dealing with this for years. The scars are going to be deep and devastating. And, you look at the thousands of people that are dying directly from the virus. There are thousands of other hidden victims that we don't talk about. People who've had elective surgeries canceled, people who have been socially isolated and been depressed as a result. So that there are going to be many, many issues that we're trying to come back from, not just 5, 10, 15 months from now, but literally over the next 5 to 10 years. I'm starting to think of this as the great rebuild, where if you have pre-existing conditions, you're more vulnerable to the coronavirus. Our society had a series of pre-existing conditions that made us more vulnerable to the coronavirus. We had a dysfunctional government, polarized media that we didn't trust, an inaccessible healthcare system, pervasive financial insecurity, low trust in institutions and government. So the virus is devastating us. We weren't in great shape before the virus, and you can see that very clearly with Trump's victory and other things. And it's going to get much worse over the next number of days. This is not something where money fixes it. It's like that kid who was struggling anyway, who's now been trapped indoors for a couple of months. It's not like you give him a check and he's fine. It's tragic. Like, people are not going to snap back like a rubber band, as you just said.
One of the last questions on UBI was from a viewer regarding this do you see UBI as a replacement, or does it work in conjunction with other government assistance programs? Because once again, it's kind of connected to the conversation about where does the money come from. Some of the conversation has been about removing other assistance programs where there's a lot of administrative costs. What would that look like?
My proposal was that universal basic income is universal but opt-in. And I would not touch any of the existing programs. But if you did decide to opt in, then you'd be foregoing benefits from certain direct cash assistance programs. So that was my original proposal. In the new world, I think we're going to have to do a lot more of a lot of things. So the existing aid programs, in my mind, are both insufficient and inefficient, so we need to move to a world where what we're doing for people is both bigger and hopefully better.
It sounds like this crisis has kind of changed your view, or expanded your view on UBI. Is that accurate?
In my mind, before, universal basic income was vitally necessary because I saw this adjustment coming down the pike. I actually thought we were already in the third inning of this automation wave, the fourth industrial revolution. And it's why Trump won in my mind. We automated away millions of manufacturing jobs that were based in the swing states. And I worked in those communities for 6 years, and most of them have never recovered. It's one reason why you're seeing the virus tear up Detroit in the way it is that, I've spent the last number of years working in Detroit, and, that place, is lacking a lot of the services that you would hope existed in a major U.S. city. So I saw universal basic income as something we needed to do immediately. Now, I believe our needs are going to be greater still, because so many pistons in our economy are essentially going to stop functioning.
Yeah.
And even the pistons that continue to function are going to function with fewer people.
I definitely wanted to ask you that, just because it felt like I knew so many people a year ago that with your initial proposal, they were like, that's outlandish. And now the main conversation is it's not enough, which is so wild to see what a year does. Not even a year.
Yes. It's been a big year. I mean, again, these circumstances are heartbreaking. And like any time I think about what's happening to this country, it's shocking. It's horrifying. I mean, I dearly wish that we could have done more to prevent and mitigate this crisis. It pains me to think about the 70 days we lost. When you were at a point where you might have been able to identify individual vectors and connections and points of contact. I talked to someone who works in public health, and we all know this. Like, they're not even bothering at all anymore. It's like, who have you been around? It's like, at this point, like, we just wait for them to show up in the hospital, and there was an opportunity. Like, it makes me so angry, because if you think about the amount of devastation that was preventable, Like it's, like right now, I think the thing to do is to be positive and help people. But I do think that there's going to be anger after this, after the crisis is up. Like that there should be on many levels.
I do wonder if people are. I mean, this is kind of just my thing. I do wonder if it's possible, just because I feel like there's a lot of, depending on if we want to say which side you're on, whichever side you're on, or whoever you're unfortunately rooting for instead of just Americans. It feels like there's an inability for people to acknowledge that we could have been doing things a lot faster, a lot earlier, and prevented lives that are going to be lost from being lost. To acknowledge that it was a good move to stop travel from China, but that it was not the only move that should have been done, right? And then other people just thinking, well, that was effort, right? And then dismissing the fact that we didn't get PPE or like get that pipeline book going.
Oh, even now, Philip, I'm infuriated by what's going on in terms of the marketplace for PPE, where you don't have a national procurement plan. Instead, you have FEMA and the federal government competing against states who are competing against each other, and it's a total savage free-for-all. That's what's going on right now. There's a set of suppliers I know who are going to states saying, okay, I've got masks and gowns and shields and all the stuff you want. And then some of the states are saying, okay, we're going to give you a purchase order, but our purchase order is we pay you net 30 days. And then the supplier is like, well, the fact is I can sell these things to anyone under the sun, so I need cash because everyone else will just give me cash. And then some of the states are like, well, we can't do that. And so then those states just don't get the PPE, and then their hospitals and their people are left wanting, and it's going to cost lives. So that's all eminently preventable right now. I mean, right now there's a dynamic where there's a national stockpile being built, and then they're hoarding it. And and then the states are being left to fend for themselves. You have rich states essentially being able to outbid poor states. I mean, so there are mistakes that were made in the past, but there are things right now that anyone rational looks at and is like, this cannot be the best way to allocate life-saving resources in a crisis.
When you say that we could have moved faster, are you talking about around January? And what would that have looked like?
I tweeted, I believe on January 20th, about the coronavirus. So at that point, you would look at it and say, okay, we should be revving up gowns, masks, ideally ventilators, trying to build up the capacity in our system. But even more important would be trying to trace anyone who was a carrier and then everyone they had contact with, and then have localized responses. I said in an interview while I was still campaigning in January, I said essentially anyone who's coming back from that market, we should be following around and saying like, hey, you should probably stay put here for a particular period of time until we make sure that you're not sick. And I said at the time that the American people would applaud this because it showed that we were on top of it. Like, instead of seeing it as intrusive, that we're like, following people who came back from China a particular period of time, it's like, we should have done it. And because we didn't, people became community infectious, in Washington in disastrous ways in that nursing home. New York is now, a quasi ghost town because the streets are, it's like my brother is living there now. And I talk to him most days, and he talks about how just utterly empty and desolate and eerie it is. So there was a period when you actually could have tried to trace individuals and figure out the points of contact. And then if someone got sick, then you actually could have backtracked and said, okay, like, here are the other people that might be at risk. Those are the actions we could have conceivably taken in January and February that could have suppressed this in a really, really significant way. And it's possible because certain other nations did similar things in South Korea, in Taiwan, where if you look at the shape of their curves, they look totally different because they clamped down on it before it spread into a community into the country in a way that you can't actually track down individuals anymore. My organization, Humanity Forward, is donating $1.2 million and counting to struggling American families, just in the way of microgrants of somewhere between $250 and $1,000. So we gave $1,000 to 1,000 families in the Bronx who needed it, and then we've given an additional $250,000 or so to families that have asked us for it on our website, movehumanityforward.com. And if you want to help, if you donate to movehumanityforward.com, every dollar will just go straight to another American family that's struggling. I would encourage you just to reach out directly to your friends and neighbors or people that you know could use a hand. But if you want us to do it for you, just go to Move Humanity Forward. And if you make a donation, we will give that money directly to someone pretty quickly, because unfortunately, and you all would understand this, we have a backlog of thousands and thousands of Americans who are struggling. And it's heartbreaking to see. If you saw some of the messages I saw, you would, like just pound your head in sadness and frustration. So if you want to help other people get through this time and you make a donation, we'll just pass it along straight to them.
That's fantastic. Hey, I hope you're still enjoying the podcast. I want to take just another second to thank one of the other sponsors of today's conversation with Babbel. We all know that learning a new language can be intimidating. Whether it's setting aside time for lessons or feeling like you're not truly seeing progress, I mean, the struggle is real. But with Babbel, you can get rid of all the roadblocks and start speaking fluently even quicker. It's designed to quickly get you speaking your new language within weeks with daily 10 to 15-minute lessons. And Babbel teaches real-life conversations and not just simple words and phrases, because its learning is accelerated through interactive dialogues. Lessons are also thoughtfully created by over 100 language experts and not by a translation machine. And with Babbel, you can choose from 14 different languages, including Spanish, French, Italian, German, and more. And their teaching method has been proven to be effective across multiple studies. Also, one of the features I like the best is the speech recognition technology. I mean, this definitely helps improve your pronunciation and accent when learning a new language. And conveniently, Babbel is available both as an app or just online, so your progress will be synced across all your devices. Right now, Babbel is offering our listeners 3 months free with a purchase of a 3-month subscription with promo code PHIL. So go to Babbel.com and use promo code PHIL on your 3-month subscription. That's BABBEL.com, promo code PHIL. Babbel, language for life. Is it in your head yet? It is in my head now forever. Okay, back to the podcast. One of the things I was kind of interested in, and you can feel free to not fully answer. I have my own opinion on it. Can I ask you, as someone that's kind of had to do the rounds running for president, what has been...
You ran for president?
No. Maybe I'm wording it wrong. No, but as someone that's run for president, because you're in a very small group, you're constantly jumping on a bunch of different shows. You're trying to appeal to all these different audiences and get FaceTime in front of them. Do you have a personal favorite show that you've done and a personal that was the most awkward one that I've done?
One podcast I really got a lot out of was the Sam Harris podcast, Making Sense. And that was one of the earliest interviews I did that really got me out to a broad audience. And I appreciate the heck out of it. I saw Sam later and I just was laughing about it. I was like, look, you launched a presidential campaign. So I have a lot of very fond associations with that interview. In terms of ones I did not enjoy, I feel bad calling someone out now. But at least there was at least one MSNBC interview where I walked off set being like, what was that about?
Was there anything, was there like a key thing that happened?
It just felt like it was the journalists' purpose to try and minimize me in any way possible.
Really?
I was like, walked off being like, huh. Like most people who followed my campaign know that there was like a brief period when I boycotted MSNBC. so it wouldn't shock people to think that like if there were like some of my least favorite interviews, like one of them might have been from them.
Well, because I was gonna ask, because I obviously haven't seen all of them, but how is the Hasan Minhaj one? Because that one, like I thought I knew where that interview was going, and then it took like a complete turn.
I enjoyed the heck out of that.
Yeah.
Hasan's a great guy, but I will say I walked off of that stage and I went to my team and was like, what the heck was that? Where my team, I guess because they know me too, they we're just like, you're going to do this, it'll be great. And I'm like, all right, sure thing. And so I went out there and, I enjoyed it, but holy cow, was the whole thing a stretch. Like he just asked questions and took me to places where it was just like, like, what are we talking about right now? I mean, it was great. And Hasan and I had a good laugh about it afterwards, and we're friends as a result. But I did say to my team afterwards, I was like, like that was like a journey. That interview was like, if anyone's curious what I'm talking about, you could probably find it online. But I will say that Hasan said to me later, he was like, "Hey, FYI, that was one of like the most viewed internet like internet shows they'd put up."
Was that was it particularly just the Netflix show in general, or like the clip of you on the street?
So there was the Netflix show, which had me in the street, but then there was something that he does that's just web only.
The reason that popped into my head was, and I was unaware of this until about 20 minutes before we hopped on this call, was I didn't realize that there was such a big reaction to your op-ed. I guess you recently talked about Asian American racism.
Yeah, and the op-ed was about the fact that Asians are not the virus, but we can be part of the cure, and let's come together and try and help our country through this time. And that was the message of the piece.
Do you feel like the criticisms that you're getting from it, it's taking the words in a way that you didn't mean, or what's your reaction to it? Because I know that I've seen a number of op-eds and then reaction online saying that it feels a little like you're trying to get the victim to make the otherwise potentially violent people kind of calm down.
I just think we all have to do more. We have to do everything we can. Asian Americans, all Americans. This is a really, really terrible time. And I will say that for Asian Americans, it's made additionally terrible by the fact that racism against us has surged because many people wrongly associate us or even blame us for the virus. And with this crisis and this challenge, we all have to do more. Asian Americans, in my opinion, have to do everything we can to help other people, and all Americans have to do everything we can to help other people.
Well, when you specifically mention Asian Americans as a part of that, do you kind of see where the criticism's coming from, or would you have if you had the option to kind of like tweak words, what would that change look like?
If you gave me a do-over, it's a great question, because I think most people understood what I was saying, which is that we just need to try and do everything we can. Our country is hurting, and that's all of us. But I probably would have wanted to flesh out certain ideas more fully, which is really hard in an op-ed format. You've probably been through this, where you submit something and then they like trim like word count. So in a way, the op-ed was like a really bad format because some of the things I was saying required additional context or completion or texture.
Interesting. So do you feel like that was provided, but that it was removed?
I think the original version probably would have raised fewer hackles. I think that's true.
Interesting. And I guess one of the last questions.
But you can't run out and say that, because that's like just the nature of the
when you said you're familiar with that, I was like, not in any way. But the last question I'll ask you, what's a question that you kind of wish that you were asked more, that would allow you to kind of expand? Because I know that for some you might be locked in as UBI, right? Universal Basic Income. But what's a question you wish people would ask you more?
Well, I guess this question, because then I could just go straight to my talking points. No, I'm kidding. that was.
We always like to end on a softball.
Well, I have to remind myself I'm not running for office anymore. I'm just trying to help people and
get us through
this.
Maybe that's the question. Maybe that's the question. What's when you're talking to people, what's the biggest difference in us talking right now versus if we had talked while you were running to be president?
Oh, I mean, I was joking about how it's like, I can go straight to like whatever message I'm supposed to cram right now. And I will say, Philip, right now it's like I probably do have a few messages I should be hitting. But right now, my main concern is just helping families and people get through this miserable, terrible time we're in. And so I'm not really like pushing anything in particular. I guess that's like the biggest thing. It's like I'm working on a bunch of things I'm very excited about, like movehumanityforward.com. Let's freaking help people. I am launching a new podcast. So if you want to try and dig into some of these problems and solutions, like that's where my head will be. I'm working on a project to try and get consumers money for our data, because right now technology companies just use and resell our data and profit from it, and we don't see a dime. So I'm working on a bunch of things I'm very, very excited about. But this is such a terrible time for the country that, it's to me, like should be a time of unity. This should be a time of us helping our neighbors, helping our like kids, schoolmates, like anyone who needs a hand. We should just be doing all we can.
I love that. For the podcast, what's the format going to be?
It's going to just be me pontificating. No, I'm kidding. It's called Yang Speaks. We're going to have on a different guest each week, who's subject matter expert in, technology, entertainment, business, culture, sports, and my goal is to be a little bit like you. I'm really admiring you too, because like you're like talking and pointing us in a particular direction, and you're eminently restrained. So I want to do a little bit more listening than certainly I did, like in most of my interview formats. But the goal is to have conversations that people really enjoy, that actually give people a sense of what's coming down the pike, like what the future is going to look like and what we can do about it. So that's the format. It should be a lot of fun. I think we're shooting for something like, hour-long episodes.
No, I'm excited to see what that looks like. It's very interesting. Just everyone that I would probably want to launch a podcast is starting or thinking about it. So I'm on board.
Well, we are all trapped indoors, man. I mean, it's gonna.
We're all trying not to shave our heads just to see what it would look like. Andrew, thank you so much for the time. I really, really appreciate this. I wish you success with the podcast and everything else. But yeah, thank you.
Where were you when I was running for president, Philip? No, I'm just kidding.
I was like, I think we were talking to your team.
You're right. I should go back there and figure out who dropped that ball.
I love it. But honestly,
hope you and your family are safe and healthy. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah, same to you. Have a great one.